when we're not sure what the energy and the spirit of the thing is, we will fill in the blank kind of where we're at in our own head right then.
Right.
And that's not always fair to the other person.
I'm Susan Goss, and as a seasoned therapist of more than 15 years, I'm honored to have had the opportunity to gain so much wisdom from so many people and love passing that knowledge on to others. So join me and some of my favorite friends as we share some tangible truths with you.
Hey guys, welcome back to Tangible Truth Podcast. I'm Susan Goss, and again, I have Brad Franklin with me. Welcome back, Brad.
Thanks, Susan. It's good to be here.
Yes, and last episode, we just barely touched on one phrase that we were going to jump back on, and that is, what is said is generally never what is heard. That's a great phrase. So we wanted to kind of jump back in and talk about that because it gets a lot of people in trouble, including us.
That's right.
Sometimes.
That's right.
Because we're talking about therapeutically, yes, we use it on couples all the time, especially, but in our own lives, you know, we have to stop and pause and go, hang on. Did I stop and clarify? Now, is that true in your own personal life? And have you used this in therapy with couples?
Yes and yes. You know, most of us assume that our definition of words is everybody else's definition. Right?
Amen.
If it makes sense to me, then it surely makes sense to you. That is not true.
It's not, is it?
It is just simply not. And clarification is always a very good tool. If you truly want to be understood, if you truly want to be connected with people, you have to do a lot of that.
You have to.
Yeah.
And repeat what you just said about assumptions. I think listeners need to hear it a second time.
Assumptions will get you in trouble. You cannot assume that what makes sense to you makes sense to other people.
No, and your definition of a word even is not somebody else's definition.
That is right.
Of a word. And then can I jump on with an explanation?
Absolutely.
Because of what you said, I highly recommend conversations of great importance are not by text or by email, but are eyeball to eyeball.
Amen.
In person.
Yes.
Would you agree?
Absolutely, I would agree.
Because I just had a couple in here not long ago that I said, may I, with your permission, see your phone? And I got the husband's phone. And then I said, with your permission, may I see your phone? And I got the wife's phone. And then the interpretation of what I had been told were totally different once I read their phones. And then what I heard verbally from them was totally different than what was read. You know, their interpretation versus what I read, totally different. Because it comes across on the phone totally different than when you get face to face. What you mean when you're face to face, you're able to convey in your face, with your eyes, with your mouth, with your facial expression, with your body language. All of that is part of communication. Mm-hmm. You can do none of that over text. But it can be interpreted by the other person as hostile, as apathy, as anything they can assume.
Well, Susan, can I say this, that when we're not sure what the energy and the spirit of the thing is, we will fill in the blank with kind of where we're at in our own head right then.
Right.
And that's not always fair to the other person. Mm-mm. Right. If it's neutral or ambiguous, we will tend to fill in based more on what I'm feeling and thinking than maybe what that other person really means.
100%. 100%. Anymore, when I text, I write it out. I reread it before I send it several times. And I'm not just checking for misspelled words, although I am, but I'm looking how I'm writing and phrasing words. Can it be misinterpreted? All the things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And once again, that's part of good relationships is being willing to do this process, slow it down. Mm-hmm. So often when people are having to have difficult conversations, we don't have them in person, or if we do, we speed up. Mm-hmm. Really, we need to be slowing down because I need you to really understand and grasp what I'm saying. And I need to do a good job of delivering that message to you. But anxiety tends to make all of us speed up, and we're having conversations that I know are going to be uncomfortable, or you're not going to like what I have to say. We all tend to speed up, and that makes the situation worse.
100% agree. And that's all under the same category. What is said is never what is heard.
Right. That's right.
So I think it's really critical to think that through, be very intentional. These are my words, but are these words that will be interpreted correctly? Not assume anything. Do not assume. Over clarify. Right. Over clarify. And did you get, I just did that last night. Did you get my message with someone? Just over clarify.
Absolutely.
If you need to, but don't assume.
Yes.
Don't assume. And we've all learned it the hard way.
Yes, we have.
So I think that's a great, great lesson. We teach our couples to do that because we don't want them to assume the worst. It's something about humans that left to assumption, it's not going to be assumed with good intent.
Right.
Right.
We typically go negative instead of positive.
Yeah. So that's a good note for sure. Now let's jump to something else. I know we've got so many, but let's jump to something else. This is a little bit, we've learned, I would say, or used the word isomorphic on the podcast before. It generally means same but different. But here's one of the terms, phrases that we've used before, but we're going to kind of pull it apart. It's my relationship to God should be reflected in my relationship with others. That's a big statement. But it's such an important statement. It sounds like it's overwhelming, but it also at the same time sounds very worshipful and very powerful and meaningful for those that know Jesus.
Yeah.
Like, of course, our relationship, of course it should be reflected, but that's not easy, is it?
No, it's not at all.
And we generally talked about this before the podcast. Why don't you share with the listeners what you were saying?
Just part of people being healthy in general is we need to be congruent within ourselves, meaning that what I say I believe, what I say with my words, is equally reflected in how I behave, how I treat other people. There has to be a congruency. There has to be a sameness. Now, the truth is we all have a little bit of a gap, right, between what I say I believe versus what I end up acting on. And we all have that. But the larger that gap between those two things, the more unhealthy I am. And that's where so many problems can happen. And where I even kind of fool myself sometimes, right? Of where I say I believe this, but then my behavior clearly shows you I don't believe that, or I believe something else quite different than that because the behavior does not match up. And part of the Christian life even is being willing to critically look at myself. Jesus was very much about that with the religious leaders of, well, you say this, but this is what's really going on here. And so, some of his biggest zingers with the scribes and the Pharisees had to do with what you're presenting on the outside isn't at all what's going on the inside.
So being congruent with our soul, with our heart, with our actions is what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
And that is so true. Is it easier said than done?
Much easier said than done. But so how do you keep your mindset on that direction and your heart set in that direction, Brad? Well, one thing I would say is this: be willing to be open to other people's feedback. Sometimes I get feedback and it makes no sense to me. And once again, initially I want to be negative. It's like, well, there's no way. No, you're imagining that. But people who love me, people who know me, people who have my best interest at heart, it is important that I listen to them when they say, hey, this is how you're coming across and it's not a good look. Now, we don't want to be people pleasers. And if someone doesn't like what I'm saying or doing, we're morphing to fit their opinion of who we should be. That's not what I'm talking about. But there are people in your life, there are people in my life who they love me and they care about me and they know me, so that when they say something, I really need to listen and consider, why does that make sense? Why are they getting that read on me when that's not what I'm meaning to send?
Mm-hmm. And then that sends you straight to God.
Absolutely.
And to say, is that true?
Absolutely, it does.
You know, I experienced that myself. I remember, and my mother was the one that did it. You know that we went through a very, very difficult season of spiritual abuse, just a very, very difficult season. But I had been writing at the time I'd already written a book on forgiveness. I had written all this stuff. I spoke on forgiveness. I was congruent in my heart on forgiveness, and going through that time of darkness, it was just awful. And you know it, Brad. You were part of a prayer warrior with me.
Right.
And the enemy was truly attacking. And my mother said to me, because she was experiencing it with us, it was just awful. And it was so hard for her. And she said, Susan, I have read your stuff on forgiveness and it helped me so, so much. And she was generally a very direct woman to me. Not a lot of, should I say, a lot of super kind words. I was raised much more direct, very direct. But she said those words meant so much and helped me with the forgiveness, forgiving others for hurting you and Steve. And she said, but you need to read your own stuff. Unforgiveness is very ugly on you. Wow. Brad. I will never forget those words.
I bet.
And I said, you were so right. And I said, thank you. And I went home. I hugged her neck. Said, you're right. It's so hurtful what they've done to my husband. She said, I know. It's so hurtful what they've done to you and him. That's why I had to forgive, and you have to too. And I went home and I did a lot of forgiveness work. But it's so true.
Yeah.
You have to listen to those that love you the most. And it was such a good thing that she did for me.
A very loving thing.
A very loving thing.
Because I'm sure that was not easy to say.
No. And the way she said it, it was just like, well, I'll never forget those words. You know, and here I was teaching it. I was teaching about forgiveness, and I wasn't forgiving. But I forgave, and it's brought me such freedom because now my heart is congruent. And it's exactly what we're talking about.
Well, and Susan, I would just say, I think the forgiveness stuff you do is some of your most powerful work because you have had to live it.
Yes.
I mean, you have had to, and I realize, you know, you thought you'd already lived through it, but then the Lord was going to take you through it again.
Yes.
An even deeper way. So you really know it now.
Yeah.
Which is a beautiful thing.
I do. Well, I don't think we can go any further than that. I think we have. I'm spent after that, but it's true. It's so true.
Well, and Susan, and can I say, I mean, you are modeling right there what it means to be congruent, because, you know, you're sitting in an office every day expecting people to be willing to come in and hear hard things from you. And there you are being willing to hear hard things from other people. And an example of someone who's not congruent would be a therapist who does that with people every day and expects other people to be vulnerable and open. But then when they're confronted, they can't do the same.
Mm.
That's a sign of very healthy things, that you can experience that, you can do that, and that you're willing to even share about it afterwards.
Well, thank you, Brad.
Yeah.
Well, it's a God thing.
Yeah.
You know,
It
He's
is.
just working on us all the time.
All the time.
You know, if we live to be 150, I always say He's going to be teaching us and growing us and working on us.
You know, and Susan, that goes back to it. And as we've been talking about these phrases, one that has hit me is, this life is harder than anybody told me it was going to be, but it's also more sweeter and productive than anybody told me it was going to be.
Mm.
And just like things you're talking about, of things that we don't think about as being part of God's plan for growing me up, but oh my gosh, they are. And the suffering that we sometimes go through and the difficulty and the pain, it is there for a reason. And I know you know that.
Mm-hmm. What a wonderful way to end the podcast.
Yeah.
It's like, so say it again, that phrase.
That life is much more difficult than anyone told us it was going to be, but it's also much sweeter and more productive than we could imagine it was going to be.
That's very true.
It is true.
It's very true.
It is true.
Oh, listeners, that's good. I hope that you've been blessed by this, and there's more to come. So thank you for joining the Tangible Truth Podcast. And Brad, thank you so much for joining us. Oh, you'll probably be on the next podcast too. Just hang on. Surprise. We love you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Tangible Truth Podcast, part of the KLRC Podcast Network.